In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a power-hungry HOA buried a natural creek under cement, thinking they could control nature itself. But when torrential rains hit, their $300,000 plan to pump water out of flooded streets backfired spectacularly, leaving chaos in its wake. This is the story of greed, arrogance, and a community pushed to its limits. If you love jaw-dropping HOA drama and tales of petty tyrants getting their comeuppance, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more crazy neighborhood sagas. Let's dive into this wild tale. The sun rose over Willow Creek Estates, a manicured suburban enclave where perfectly trimmed hedges and identical beige mailboxes lined the streets. The neighborhood, nestled in a low-lying valley, had once been a haven of natural beauty, named for the babbling creek that wound through its heart. The creek, a shallow but persistent stream, had carved its path through the land for centuries, fed by underground springs and seasonal rains. It was a feature that drew families to the area, offering a serene backdrop to their cookie-cutter homes. But the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, led by the iron-fisted Margaret Hensley, saw the creek not as a treasure, but as an eyesore. To Margaret, its muddy banks and occasional overflow during spring rains were a blight on her vision of a pristine, orderly community. She dreamed of transforming Willow Creek Estates into a showcase of modern suburban perfection, and the creek with its untamed flow stood in her way. Margaret, a retired accountant with a penchant for control, had ruled the HOA for a decade. Her meetings were legendary for their rigidity, every agenda item timed to the minute, every dissenting voice swiftly silenced. She had a loyal following among the board, a group of like-minded residents who believed in her vision of uniformity. Together, they enforced rules with zeal. No unapproved mailbox colors, no overgrown lawns, no visible clotheslines. But the creek was Margaret's white whale. For years, she'd petitioned to have it rerouted or filled, claiming it lowered property values and posed a flooding risk. The truth was, the creek had never caused significant damage. Its occasional overflows were minor, soaking a few backyards before receding. But Margaret's obsession grew, fueled by complaints from a handful of residents who disliked the creek's natural messiness. In the spring of 2023, Margaret saw her chance. A new developer, eager to curry favor with the HOA, proposed a plan to bury the creek under a layer of cement, turning its path into a sleek, paved drainage channel. The project would cost $50,000, funded by a special assessment on homeowners. Margaret framed it as a necessary upgrade, a way to modernize the neighborhood and prevent future flooding. At the HOA meeting, she presented glossy renderings of a clean, concrete-lined channel, promising it would raise property values and eliminate maintenance headaches. Opposition was sparse. A few residents, including retiree Tom Grayson, raised concerns about the environmental impact and the cost, but Margaret dismissed them as short-sighted. The vote passed and work began. The construction was a spectacle. Heavy machinery roared through the neighborhood, tearing up the creek's banks. Workers diverted the water temporarily, pumping it into holding tanks while they poured concrete over the creek bed. The once vibrant stream, home to fish, frogs, and wildflowers, was entombed in a gray slab. By summer, the project was complete. Margaret stood at the edge of the new drainage channel, hands on her hips, beaming with pride. The neighborhood, she declared, was finally free of its unsightly flaw. But beneath the surface, the creek's underground springs continued to flow, unaware of the concrete barrier above. Nature, as it often does, had plans of its own. That fall, the rains came early. A tropical storm swept through the region, dumping inches of water in days. The concrete channel, designed to funnel water efficiently, couldn't handle the volume. The creek's springs, still active underground, pushed water upward, but the concrete blocked its natural path. Instead of flowing downstream, the water pooled beneath the surface, saturating the soil. Streets began to flood. Driveways turned into shallow lakes, basements in low-lying homes filled with murky water. Residents, unaware of the creek's role in managing runoff, panicked. Margaret, ever the leader, called an emergency HOA meeting and proposed a solution: a $300,000 pumping operation to divert water from the streets into a nearby retention pond. The board, desperate to save face, approved the plan without hesitation. The pumps arrived, massive machines that hummed day and night. They sucked water from the streets and piped it to the pond, but the effort was futile. The underground springs kept pushing water up, and the concrete channel now cracked in places from the pressure couldn't contain it. The neighborhood became a soggy mess. Lawns turned to mud, cars stalled in flooded intersections. Residents waded through ankle-deep water to retrieve their mail. Tom Grayson, who had warned against burying the creek, watched from his porch, shaking his head. He'd spent years studying the area's geology and knew the creek was more than a surface feature. It was part of a delicate ecosystem that balanced the valley's water table. Now that balance was shattered. As the weeks passed, the pumping operation became a financial black hole. The $300,000 budget ballooned as equipment broke down, and contractors demanded overtime pay. Residents, already furious about the special assessment for the creek project, were livid. The HOA's reserve fund dwindled, and rumors swirled that Margaret had mismanaged the budget. Some began to question her leadership, whispering about conflicts of interest with the developer who'd buried the creek. Margaret, unyielding, deflected blame. She claimed the flooding was a freak event, unrelated to the creek project, but the evidence was undeniable. Cracks in the concrete channel grew wider, and water seeped through, forming puddles that refused to drain. The neighborhood, once a symbol of suburban perfection, was now a cautionary tale of hubris. By winter, the situation worsened. The pumps, running non-stop, couldn't keep up with the relentless springs. The retention pond overflowed, sending water back into the streets. Homeowners faced thousands in repair costs for damaged foundations and flooded basements. A few began researching legal options, consulting attorneys about suing the HOA for negligence. Tom Grayson, now a reluctant leader of the dissenters, organized a petition to remove Margaret from the board. The neighborhood was divided. Those loyal to Margaret defended her vision, while others saw her as the architect of their misery. The tension simmered, waiting for a breaking point. As the rains continued, the question wasn't whether the neighborhood could recover, but whether it could survive the consequences of its own ambition. The fallout from the flooding consumed Willow Creek Estates. The neighborhood, once a postcard of suburban tranquility, now resembled a waterlogged battlefield. Mud-caked streets and soggy lawns greeted residents each morning, a constant reminder of the HOA's failed experiment. Margaret Hensley, undeterred by the chaos, doubled down on her leadership. She stood before the community at another packed HOA meeting, her voice steady as she outlined a new plan. Reinforce the concrete channel with additional cement and expand the pumping operation. The cost, she admitted, would require another special assessment. This time $200,000. The room erupted in protests, but Margaret's loyalists on the board nodded in agreement, their faith in her unshaken. For them, the creek's burial was a bold step toward progress, and the flooding was merely a temporary setback. Outside the meeting hall, the reality was grimmer. The underground springs, relentless in their push against the concrete, had caused more than just flooding. The soil beneath the neighborhood was shifting, destabilized by the trapped water. Cracks appeared in home foundations, spiderwebbing across driveways and patios. Utility lines buried decades ago began to fail as the saturated ground eroded their supports. Power outages became routine, plunging entire blocks into darkness during storms. The retention pond, now a muddy swamp, attracted mosquitoes and emitted a foul odor that wafted through the neighborhood. Residents who had once boasted about their idyllic community now avoided inviting guests, embarrassed by the mess. Tom Grayson emerged as a quiet but determined voice of reason. A retired geologist, he understood the creek's role in the valley's ecosystem better than most. He spent hours poring over old maps and hydrological surveys, confirming what he'd suspected. The creek's underground springs were part of a vast network that regulated water flow across the region. Burying the creek had disrupted this balance, turning the neighborhood into a giant sponge. Tom shared his findings at community gatherings, held in his garage to avoid HOA oversight. A small but growing group of residents rallied behind him, their frustration with Margaret's regime boiling over. They called themselves the Creek Restoration Coalition, a grassroots effort to undo the damage and hold the HOA accountable. The coalition faced an uphill battle. Margaret's influence ran deep, and her allies controlled the HOA's finances and communications. She dismissed the coalition as a group of hysterical naysayers and accused Tom of stirring unrest to undermine her authority. She even hired a public relations consultant to spin the narrative, sending glossy newsletters to residents that blamed the flooding on climate change and unprecedented weather patterns. But the truth was harder to hide. A local environmental group caught wind of the creek's burial and began investigating, citing potential violations of state water management laws. Their report, published in the town newspaper, detailed how the concrete channel had disrupted the local watershed, threatening wildlife and downstream communities. The article sparked outrage beyond Willow Creek Estates, putting pressure on the HOA to act. As spring approached, the neighborhood braced for another rainy season. The pumps, now a permanent fixture, groaned under the strain of constant use. Their motors burned out, requiring costly replacements that further drained the HOA's funds. Residents received notices of yet another assessment, this time to cover emergency repairs. The coalition seized the opportunity, circulating a petition to halt the pumping operation and redirect funds toward restoring the creek. Tom presented a detailed plan, backed by his research to remove the concrete and allow the creek to flow naturally again. The cost, he estimated, would be high but far less than the endless cycle of pumping and repairs. His proposal gained traction, especially among younger families who valued the creek's ecological and aesthetic benefits. Margaret, sensing her grip on power slipping, launched a counteroffensive. She organized a community beautification event, promising to plant flowers along the concrete channel to distract from its cracks. The event was a flop. Only a handful of her loyalists showed up and the flowers wilted in the waterlogged soil. Meanwhile, the coalition's petition gathered hundreds of signatures, enough to force a special election to replace the HOA board. The neighborhood buzzed with tension as neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries now avoided eye contact. The battle lines were drawn. Margaret's vision of control versus the coalition's call for restoration. As the election loomed, a massive storm system formed on the horizon, promising rains that could push the neighborhood to its breaking point. The fate of Willow Creek Estates hung in the balance, caught between a stubborn past and an uncertain future. If you're hooked on this wild HOA saga, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell for more epic neighborhood dramas. Drop a comment with your own HOA horror stories. We want to hear them. Stay tuned for the next chapter of this flooded fiasco.